Good evening, everyone. I'm Jo Fielding, the Director of Administrative Services with the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference, and I'd like to welcome you to this informational session this evening, which will be led by Bishop John Scholl and Matt Morley, our Chancellor. Before we get to that, I would like to open with a couple housekeeping items. The first being that you will note that there is no chat tonight. This has been disabled on purpose, so you don't need to call any of us and tell us that it's broken. We would really like you to focus on the information that is being presented by Bishop and Matt, and then use the question and answer feature that is located on the toolbar of your Zoom. It usually is at the bottom, sometimes it's at the top. Type in your questions, and this will be monitored by our extended cabinet this evening. They will be answering some of the questions, although you may see that something is not answered immediately. It's not that we are not paying attention to your questions, it's that it may be something that we would like to answer to the whole body, or it may be something that we maybe don't know the answer to yet, and we will then include it in an FAQ that we will publish to our website. This is being recorded and will also be published to the website, and we're hoping to keep this to an hour. So if we don't get your question answered within that hour's time, please note that we will be recording all of it and publishing it again to our website. I believe that that is it for now. And so without further ado, I will yield to the leader of the Greater New Jersey and Eastern PA Conference, Bishop John Scholl.
Great. Thank you so much, Jo. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we come to you out of the depths of our soul, knowing that in you there is faith, hope, love, justice, peace. No matter what the church goes through, no matter what the world goes through, God, we know that you desire a deep and meaningful relationship with each one of us. And so, God, we just come tonight saying thank you. Thank you for being the God that you are. Thank you for your grace in Jesus Christ. Thank you for your love. Thank you for your hope for us and your church. Now, God, help us to continue to be open to the movement of your Spirit, to discern your wisdom, and to be open to the possibilities you have for us. All this we pray in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen. Well, again, I want to thank you for taking time to join tonight to learn more about the discernment process, particularly as it engages the question of disaffiliation for congregations. And we know that this is a time of discernment and really trying to understand God's calling for our future. How did we get to this place? Back in the 1970s, at a particular general conference, there was legislation that added words to our Book of Discipline, a very simple phrase that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. That phrase has been discussed and debated and added to, and continual seeking of what does that mean for the United Methodist Church. Over these last 50 years or so, we've continued as a denomination to try and really discern and understand what God wants for our church. And there have been many general conferences that have engaged in a significant conversation, important conversation. And most recently in the 2019 General Conference, there was a special General Conference called to look at this in particular. And there were actually several proposals that were presented to the 2019 General Conference about how we would proceed as a denomination. And there were a couple of votes that were very, very close. As a matter of fact, there were only, I think, if I recall, about 4 votes separating on one particular matter of about, 800, 900 delegates which is pretty remarkable and really just shows the differences within the life of the United Methodist Church. But a plan was passed. It was a plan that was presented by a group representing traditionalists within the denomination. And in that legislation, it allowed for congregations to leave, to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church for reasons of conscience, because they did not agree with the Book of Discipline. And right now, our Book of Discipline continues with the legislation and the words that do not allow gay and lesbian persons to be ordained in the United Methodist Church or for same-gender weddings. That language continues in our United Methodist Church. So there may be congregations that want to disaffiliate because they do not agree with our Book of Discipline, or because there are churches that believe that denomination is not being faithful to its calling to uphold that, and for reasons of conscience also to disaffiliate from the United Methodist Church. I want you to know that I believe in the words of Jeremiah, the 29th chapter, the 11th verse. God has not brought us to this place for our destruction, but for a future with hope. And I truly believe that God has a great desire and hope for the United Methodist Church, and that who we are and what we are about will continue in powerful ways. Just as we are working in Kentucky and helping those who have been flooded and people who have lost their lives, and through that whole region. We've also been working on Hurricane Ida as United Methodist, not just in Eastern Pennsylvania, but all the places that Ida came through, and the money that's poured in and the money that's been received by Eastern Pennsylvania to help build and rebuild homes. We continue to build clinics and hospitals and new churches all around the world. And there is no doubt in my mind that God is going to continue that work through the United Methodist Church, even in the midst of our differences and our disagreements, because God has a future of hope for the United Methodist Church. Now, we have said that at our annual conference session, that we would help congregations engage in a discernment process about many things, about their future, how to come out of the pandemic, how to grow their vitality, how to increase sustainability, how to work toward ending the sin of racism, and also how, if they so chose, to look at disaffiliating from the United Methodist Church. And so we invite churches for many different reasons to spend these next months in a time of discernment. And what is God calling us to do? Now, some people ask me, what is discernment? What does that really mean? And the way I describe discernment is it is the church and the individuals of the church, individual congregations, really seeking to be so close that our thoughts and God's thoughts become one. That the way we think and the way we love and the way we care and the way we experience the Holy Spirit calling us in the future actually becomes one, and that we and God are moving alike. Wow. I'll tell you, I seek that throughout my life. And only on occasion have I felt that close to God. But that's really what we want to seek for our congregations in this most important time, and particularly for those congregations that are thinking about the possibility of discernment. How do we become so close to God that God's thoughts and our thoughts are the same? And that's a real challenge. Because there are many different opinions and many different ways to look at things. But our hope and our attempt is to help facilitate conversation in and through congregations that are looking at disaffiliation to discern what God has for them. Now, by action of the 2019 Special General Conference, as I've talked about, the 2016 Book of Discipline was modified and has been amended to allow for a process of disaffiliation of a local church over issues related to human sexuality. That paragraph is found in 2553. And there it talks about congregations going through a process. Now, the General Conference has acted and has essentially said there are at least 3 things that need to occur for a congregation to disaffiliate. Number 1, the congregation has to vote as a church conference. So the General Conference wanted this to be a church action, not a group of leaders, not a leader, but a total church action. And so that's why it's a church conference in which all of the professing members of the congregation have a vote in whatever the congregation decides. The second is that the Board of Trustees of the annual conference will put together a term sheet. That term sheet shall describe the terms by which a congregation may leave the denomination. And that has been entrusted to the Board of Trustees with input from the cabinet, from the treasurer, from the chancellor, from the benefits officer. And so there's input from other persons as well into that term sheet. But the final decision of what is in that term sheet belongs to the Board of Trustees. And then lastly, the annual conference has to vote. Now, the local church, when it votes, has to vote a 2/3 majority. The annual conference by a simple majority to allow a congregation to leave. Now, why do we have to go through these different experiences and work to do this? Well, in our Book of Discipline, there's what is called the trust clause. And that trust clause has been since the beginning of Methodism. That trust clause has essentially said when a congregation dissolves or decides no longer to be a United Methodist congregation, that all of its property comes back to the denomination. So this 2019 decision, this change in the Book of Discipline, has put a pause on the trust clause. It hasn't done away with the trust clause. It's just put a pause on the trust clause and opened a window in which churches might leave the denomination and being able to take their property with them. But there are certain things that a congregation will have to pay, and those are in the term sheet. And they involve a number of different things as it relates to past pension liabilities, apportionments, back billables, and other items that the annual conference may find it necessary to collect from a congregation in order to leave. So in other words, the congregation doesn't have to pay for the full value of its property or give up all of its assets in terms of leaving about matters of human sexuality, but may make certain payments. Now, I also want to say this. Right now, I see within our denomination a competitive battle going on, a competitive battle for congregations and for people. And I want you to know that we in Eastern Pennsylvania are not in competition for congregations. We are about discernment and what God is calling. You will not see us trying to cajole, try to convince you to stay, any of those kinds of things. This is a discernment process and trying to bring a congregation so close and in so alignment with God that your thinking and God's thinking are one, and that you are working together and in tune with each other. And we will honor the decisions of the congregation. I want to say that for those that want to continue to stir up dissension, disagreement, saying things about one another is not helpful to discerning the will and the call of God. It actually clouds things. It makes it cloudy. God wants to speak to us directly. And so I invite you to refrain from trying to say things about one another or others to try and convince people to your side. This isn't about being on one side or the other. This is about aligning and attuning with God and being a part of God's movement. So we'll honor your discernment, and we're not here to try and convince you. We're going to have facilitators that will come in and work with your congregation through prayer and conversation to really discern what God has for your congregation. Now, there are 6 things we are inviting congregations to discern. The first 3 are about remaining with the United Methodist Church, and the last 3 are about leaving the United Methodist Church. Now, I want to say right up front, every church doesn't have to go through the discernment process. It's not necessary. If your church is clear about who you are and you're staying with the United Methodist Church, you don't have to go through the discernment process. This is for congregations that are really trying to discern what God is calling their congregation to. Now, the first 3 areas of discernment, the first is to continue with the United Methodist Church. And so your congregation, one of the decisions or one of the opportunities will be to continue with the United Methodist Church. The second is to continue with the United Methodist Church and as a United Methodist congregation and engage in holy conversation about how your congregation will navigate differences within your congregation and also within the denomination. Now, we know that there are some congregations that are 50-50 congregations or 60-40 or maybe even 70-30. And there's differences of opinion one way or another. And it creates some challenges for the congregation. We want to come alongside of you and work with you to be in conversation about how to navigate those differences, to keep your mind and your focus on the mission of God and working toward the things that God is calling you to do. And then the third is to continue as a United Methodist congregation and develop a covenant with the cabinet about how your congregation will be in ministry with and by LGBTQ persons. So in other words, some congregations want to make sure that their traditions, their concerns will be honored around appointments, around particular ministry with and by LGBTQ persons, and that this will be honored by the cabinet as we continue to work with congregations, as we make appointments. And these covenants are something that the cabinet has said that it will honor and that it will continue to work with a congregation in terms of its own traditions, its own experiences, and its own beliefs. And so those first 3 are about staying with the denomination, and your congregation, if it's participating in the discernment process, may discern one of those 3. Again, you don't have to participate in the discernment process, but if there's one of those 3 that you would like your congregation to participate in, you just need to reach out to your district superintendent, and we'll be glad to work with you, particularly in terms of navigating challenging and graceful conversations within your congregation, or developing a covenant about how the cabinet will work with your congregation and its tradition and beliefs. And then the last 3 are about disaffiliation. And those 3 are to disaffiliate and become a member of the Global Methodist Church. That's a new denomination that is forming, that has been at work organizing for people to leave the United Methodist Church through the Wesleyan Covenant Association and become part of the Global Methodist Church. And so your congregation may discern and say, you know what, we want to leave and become part of the Global Methodist Church. The 5th area is to disaffiliate and become part of another denomination. Maybe you want to be a part of another denomination. And so we would want to work with you and help facilitate that if that is your desire. And the 6th decision that you could make is to disaffiliate and become an independent, non-denominational church. So you'll not be a part of any denomination, but be an independent congregation. So those are the 6. The first 3 are about remaining with the United Methodist Church and continuing to work with the United Methodist Church and our working with you. The last 3 are about disaffiliating and which route your congregation might take. Now, I want to say there are no shortcuts to discernment, and that discernment and becoming one with God and listening to God and really discerning God's voice is something that you can't take a shortcut for. That there has to be prayer, has to be conversation, has to be listening to each other, listening for God in each other, and listening for the voice of the Holy Spirit. And I also want to say that I and the cabinet and the leaders of Eastern Pennsylvania would like all of our congregations to stay. All of our congregations are important to Eastern Pennsylvania. We value you. We value the work and the ministry that you've been about. And we believe that we are stronger in our diversity, and that it is in our diversity and many voices that we continue to sharpen and listen for the voice of God. And so we invite all of our congregations to stay, and that we want to work with you through covenants and other avenues, that we can work together to help you fulfill and lead your calling as God is calling you into the future. And I want you to know that I and the cabinet are in earnest prayer and will continue to be in earnest prayer for each and every one of our congregations, and especially those that choose to go through the discernment process for disaffiliation. We believe that God is speaking to us in this moment and this time, and we want to remain open to what God is calling each of us to. So again, thank you for being with us tonight. We're here to support you. We're here to help answer any questions. And so at this time, we're going to take any questions that have been coming in through the question, and Joe will read those out to us, and Matt and I will respond to your questions tonight. I'm glad that Matt is with us. Matt is Chancellor, the Chief Counsel, Chief Lawyer for the Eastern Pennsylvania Annual Conference, and his work has been invaluable in many, many different areas. And so, Matt, I'm grateful for your joining us tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So we don't have a lot of questions, but I will share these. I think they might be helpful for others to hear the answers to. The first one is, if you only have about 15 people attending church, how do you conduct a vote?
Well, you'll see that each time the church meets, it will be a church conference. And so that any votes taken in any of the meetings will be official votes of the congregation. If there are 15 members of your congregation, and it's not just for the attenders, it's also for maybe people who are not able to attend every Sunday. But if there are 15, then all 15 will be able to participate, and all 15 will have a voice and also a vote in the process. And it will be run just like any other congregation. If there are 15 people or 1,500 people, we'll be working with your congregation through the process.
And if I may, as far as there's no minimum quorum requirement for that church vote, for the vote, it has to just be 2/3 of those present or professing members present and voting. So if you've got 15 and 8 vote, well, I'm sorry, if 11 were to vote in favor of disaffiliation, that would be sufficient.
Right.
Almost went with a simple majority. Sorry about that.
Is there a 7th discernment option to simply close the church where members disperse to join other congregations?
Well, church closure is always something that is a possibility for congregations. And we do have a process that helps a congregation work through that. In our book of discipline, it's called the 213 process. And if that's something a congregation is interested in, we'd be more than willing to work with them on that.
Will those, my questions are coming in, and so everything keeps moving now, sorry. Sure. When will the actual term sheet be made available to the local churches?
Well, the term sheet will be an initial term sheet, a projected term sheet. And I want to be very clear about that. The final term sheet will be finalized by the Board of Trustees. And there are a number of pieces of the term sheet that can't be fully understood or realized until certain actions by the church conference are taken, and also the due diligence. We have found, not just in Eastern Pennsylvania, but all across the denomination, sometimes there are things in the deeds that require payments and other things. And so the initial term sheet will be shared, or the projected term sheet will be shared in the first session, so that a congregation will be able to hear preliminarily what the costs might be for a congregation to leave in the first session. But I want to make very, very clear, it's preliminary, could change, and there could be significant changes depending on some different variables that might happen through the process. Matt, you might want to add anything further to that.
I would. I'd like to add that I agree that first term sheet would be very, very preliminary to the extent that it can be shared, because part of the discernment process too that the trustees are envisioning is information sharing information with the conference trustees, because there is information we would have to gather, the trustees would have to gather in order to even put together a best guess at this point as far as the term sheet's concerned. So there will be an information request that goes out to a local church's leadership as they proceed down this discernment path that would be required before any sort of final numbers can be put together.
There are several questions regarding the term sheet, such as will the trustees require an additional payment based on the market value of the church property? And if so, how much of that is a percentage? What's the general framework of the term sheet? How might a church know if they can financially afford disaffiliation before paying to enter the process? And do they need to request a term sheet in order to get a better understanding of the financial impact on their church?
Well, the term sheet will be shared in the first session, and so they don't need to request. We can appreciate that a church might pay something and then decide that they are not going to disaffiliate, and churches that don't disaffiliate any funds will be returned to them that might be paid along the way. So churches should not worry about entering into the process or making any initial payment for the process. If they decide not to disaffiliate, those will be returned to them.
If a church wants to stay with United Methodism, but does not agree with changing the discipline to include ordination of LGBTQ, what is the process for that? And will they be required to accept an LGBTQ pastor and perform same-sex marriages in the church?
Yeah, well, that again goes back to those first three. If a congregation decides to stay, what are further conversations they might want to have as a congregation, or might want to be in dialogue with the cabinet. The cabinet has always taken very seriously the conversations that happen before any appointment is made. The input from the congregation is taken very seriously. And quite frankly, ours is not to disrupt congregations through appointments, but help congregations move forward through appointments. And so we will take very seriously the things that congregations share with us about their needs, their desires, and who they believe best serves the congregation.
Bishop, can you just briefly give a quick summary of what kind of items are on the term sheet?
Matt, you might be better at working with the Board of Trustees to handle that question.
Right. I'm happy to give a very brief overview at this point. Many of the items on the term sheet are actually required by paragraph 2553 of the discipline. But I should also stress there have been some recent changes at the denominational level with Westpath on how pension liability is calculated. And the conference trustees have not met since that was announced. So some of these items we've not been able to, the conference trustees haven't been able to sit down and evaluate whether any changes need to be made. But generally, the goal that the conference trustees had is very much what the bishop described earlier. It's not intended to be punitive, but we also want to make sure that those churches that remain are not put in a worse position because of the disaffiliation. So some of the items that are there are unpaid apportionments for the 12 months immediately prior to disaffiliation, an additional 12 months apportionments as calculated by the annual conference, pro rata share of the unfunded pension liability, pro rata share of unfunded retiree medical, some payments that would assist with the transition of any clergy, some payments that would assist with the transition of any church members that decided to not go with a disaffiliating congregation, any loans that are outstanding, unforgiven historical balances, items like this really. And I don't want to drill down into too much detail before it's been finalized given some of these recent changes. But the basic idea here is to put the annual conference and those churches that decide to stay in as good a footing or in the same footing as if there weren't a disaffiliation, so that, so to speak, that there's not, just the remaining churches aren't sitting there holding an empty bag, so to speak.
Thank you. Could someone define or if members cannot attend the vote, can they vote by mail? At a local church?
Generally the church conference, it's those present and voting is what, is outlined in terms of, so they'd have to be present and voting.
Bishop Scholl, can you explain further what the covenant might look like to develop with LGBTQ persons? Can conservative congregations still use their present liturgy?
Well, I don't know what the present liturgy is in terms of what a congregation might be using, but each covenant would really be tailored to the particular congregation and its work and its ministry, and not one that is prescripted. And so there would be some conversation and some general questions that would help to better understand what a congregation needs and how we might covenant. In terms of liturgy, in the United Methodist Church, there's a format for liturgy, but not necessarily a prescribed liturgy that every church must use on any particular given Sunday.
Why are churches being asked to vote on disaffiliation before the 2024 General Conference vote?
Because the Book of Discipline has created a window of opportunity for churches to disaffiliate. and that window closes on December 31st, 2023, which will be approximately a year ahead of the next General Conference. So that is what is in our discipline now, and that's what we're working with and abiding by.
And just to be clear, that deadline, when that window closes, that's not the deadline to have a vote. That's the deadline for the disaffiliation to have been approved by annual conference and all payments and other activities under the disaffiliation agreement to have been completed.
Right. Everything has to be completed by December 31st, 2023. And that's why congregations really need to notify us this September so that we can begin to work with them so that we are prepared for the 2023 annual conference session. And then congregations would have approximately 6 months to meet all of the terms in the term sheet in order to disaffiliate. So all payments would have to be made. Any other things within the term sheet would have to be completed by the end of 2023.
Since some trust clauses have been deemed unenforceable in other states, how might the trust clause be viewed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey as an enforcing clause, and has that been an issue in our region?
In New Jersey, it's been upheld by the Supreme Court, the New Jersey Supreme Court. So the trust clause of the United Methodist Church has been upheld there. It's also part of the laws of the state under, if I recall, Title 15 or Title 16. In Pennsylvania, there, you know, it's not been. Well, Matt, you might speak to this a little more in terms of what has actually happened in Pennsylvania law.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has had a trust clause case. It's been, if I remember correctly, about 45 or 50 years. I believe it was in the 70s. And it was upheld under a contract theory, essentially saying that our local churches, in exchange for certain services from the annual conference, entered into a contract. So in that case, it was upheld on that contract theory. But to be perfectly honest, it's been 50 years. We don't have any very current case law on it. And unlike New Jersey and some other jurisdictions, it is not written into the state statutes. So.
Just to, you know, I certainly don't profess to be a lawyer or a constitutional lawyer for sure, but essentially church state means that anything that's prescribed by the church is a matter of the church, and that the state would not get involved unless it is, as Matt is saying, contract law. And so that's what would be before the state, not the book of discipline or even our trust clause, but is there a contract here, and does the contract have to be fulfilled? And so the contract is our book of discipline and what the book of discipline says, and that's what, you know, is the contract as it relates to the trust clause.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So courts don't want to get into deep theological debates, right? They don't want to get into that. But there is a doctrine called neutral principles of law that if a court can resolve a dispute through application of neutral principles of law, like contract law, they can get involved in controversies between church actors, so to speak, but they're not going to delve into theology. And that is the PA Supreme Court case that I mentioned, determined that application of the trust clause could be done in a secular court by application of neutral principles of law.
If a church decides to disaffiliate and the pastor has a desire to go with them, may they do so, or are they compelled to remain United Methodist?
Well, any church that disaffiliates and the pastor decides to go with them would be surrendering their credentials with the United Methodist Church, their church membership in the United Methodist Church. And so they would need to join a new denomination, or if it was going independent, would have to be recognized by that congregation as a clergy person.
If members disaffiliate, will they still be able to vote in the 2024 General Conference?
Only United Methodist or those who are from other denominations and recognized by our Book of Discipline as being a delegate to the General Conference. So if a person was a delegate to the General Conference and left the United Methodist Church, they would no longer have a vote in the General Conference, nor in the annual conference, nor in any of the bodies of the United Methodist Church.
If you have people in your congregation who tithe, but they're not actual members, can they vote?
No, only professing members of the congregation may vote.
How do you become a facilitator to help churches with the process? Is there an application?
There's not an application. The cabinet has gone through a number of names and received recommendations. And the cabinet has worked very hard to identify people who are open-minded, not going to advocate for a particular position or a particular decision by a congregation, but have the spiritual practices of prayer, discernment, wisdom, openness to the Holy Spirit. So we've been we've been working with and developing a group of people who will be trained. And again, as I stated earlier, ours is not to try and try to influence you about what your decision should be, but only to help the congregation be open to the movement of the Spirit.
If retired, must a pastor turn in his or her credentials to go with a disaffiliated church?
Yes.
If a church council votes to remain in the UMC without exploring discernment, but individual members still want to explore discernment, is there a path to challenge the church council's vote?
That's a great question. I think the only way that could be done is through a church conference.
There are many questions about percentages of assessed value of property and what it costs to disaffiliate. And I don't know if you want to answer those or whether you want to defer that to an FAQ on the website and the term sheet.
So as I saw a couple of those questions, the question was, is there a percentage of the property that must be paid and things of that nature? Matt, I don't know if you want to answer that.
I don't think that that's something that we can answer right now, in that, again, given some of the changes that recently came out from Westpath, the trustees have not been able to consider whether those changes will have changes elsewhere in the disaffiliation agreement. So that is something that I can commit to working. We have a trustees meeting this upcoming Friday, I believe. I can work with conference staff to make sure that is addressed in the FAQs, but I don't feel like I can give a definitive answer on that at this time.
I think I saw one more that, if they're, given the continuing COVID issues, can a church handle a vote with a combination of Zoom and in person? Or do all voters have to be in person?
We're going to look at that and look at that very closely. And again, ours is to help congregations and also to keep people safe. And so we'll be looking at COVID protocols with any particular meeting.
A congregant asked, why was the general conference moved from 2022 to 2024 instead of 2023?
The Commission on the General Conference, which is a group of delegates from the General Conference from around the world, had a series of meetings, and they voted to postpone the General Conference because of the pandemic.
Based on the number of churches that choose to disaffiliate, will that require that those churches that remain in the UMC face increases to their apportionment fees due to the less churches contributing?
That is something that I know there has been some scenario planning previously when conversations started about churches leaving the denomination. And it's an ongoing conversation. And we would first look to reduce the budget in order to handle any congregations disaffiliating.
Can you speak to why we're seeing great disparities in separation costs across the country, ranging from $0 to many millions?
Because we are a contextual church, and different annual conferences are making different decisions about the disaffiliation and the cost for disaffiliation.
Another major factor in that is just the status of pension liabilities. Some conferences' pensions are significantly better funded than others, which even before you get to the trustees setting the terms and conditions at each annual conference, it's a very different context, and there are different challenges associated therewith just because of those differing pension costs.
Not exactly sure of the context of this, but what if a church fails to vote on discernment?
The only way it is able to disaffiliate, if it wants to disaffiliate, the only way is by a 2/3 majority vote on disaffiliation. So a no vote would mean that they would continue with the United Methodist Church.
I think that is most of the informational questions that we have.
All right. Good. Well, these have been excellent questions. We'll wait just another minute in case somebody felt like their question wasn't responded to, if you wanted to put that in again, or if the response that you received needed further clarification, we'll be glad to try and clarify anything. But these have been excellent questions. Thank you.
What is the current status of our pension liability? May I answer that?
Yes. Yes, Jill.
We are currently,
I were hoping you would.
We're currently 100% funded, but that is a snapshot in time, and we are actually assessed based on a 2-year lag. So the market conditions have not hit that yet. That's something that we will see in 2024. They did just change the liability from wanting it to be 110%, which is something that we've been striving for as a conference, to 105%. So it did decrease that just this past month. So that's where we are right now.
So just a word about what 100% means today, and what does that same 100% mean 10 years from now or 20 years from now?
Yeah, well, it's all it's sort of like paying for a mortgage in advance. And so you don't really know what that cost will be. It's all actuarially conducted, and it's projected to be concluded in 2056. So we have a lot of years to go before the end of it. And there's a lot of moving pieces. There's the market conditions. There's how many people are left in the plan. There's how many survivors there are. And so just because we're 100% funded right now doesn't mean we will be 100% funded in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. That's something that we need to watch. And this is partly why we continue to bill for that going forward. Another piece that goes into that is that we need to pay upfront for any increases in our past service rate, and to keep that at a rate that's a livable wage for our retirees. We need to make sure that we're putting that into the puzzle piece as well.
Yeah, I thank you, Joe. That's excellent. And I think that's a great way to look at it, is as it's, though it's a mortgage, we're 100% paid on our mortgage today, but that mortgage payments have to continue to be made going forward. And so we have to make ongoing payments. With churches leaving the denomination, money that we might have been depending on from them, we would not have, and therefore we need to capture that money to pay the unfunded liability pieces.
And let me just clarify, Joe, when you say we are 100% funded, that means we're 100% funded for plan funding purposes and not necessarily for the disaffiliation calculation that's utilized. So that's correct. Under the new 1504.23 of the discipline, Westpath calculates whether or not we are fully funded or what our funding target is based on, and I'm quoting here, market factors similar to a commercial annuity provider. So the annual conference doesn't really have any say in what our aggregate unfunded liability is. That number is provided to the benefits officer, to Joe, essentially how underfunded the pension is using those factors, which could be very different than our funding factors. And then the annual conference, under a resolution I believe we passed in 2020, allocates that based on the apportionment formula.
Correct. And I should also say that the unfunded liability is not just the pre-82, it's all of our plans. We have one big plan that's divided up into sections. And so while the CRSP plan is currently funded on an ongoing basis, we do have an MPP plan that has the potential to become unfunded if market conditions suggest that happens.
And, you know, let me also just say a word at this point. We have had questions in the past. Is the term sheet negotiable? And the answer to that is no, the term sheet is the term sheet. That is what must be paid in order for a congregation to disaffiliate. Remember what I said earlier, the trust clause has been suspended, which would mean that a congregation would not be able to take its property with them. This is in lieu of the trust clause and making a payment. So it's not something that's negotiable. So when you get your term sheet, it's not as if you can then start to sit down and try and negotiate that term sheet. The term sheet is the term sheet based on particular calculations that the Board of Trustees will make, plus also what are unpaid loans and other things from the past and anything that might be in deeds and all of those sorts of things.
I have two questions here. The first is that what services do churches lose if they disaffiliated, since we are a globally connected church?
Well, there are a number of things that congregations receive, you know, through the appointment process, through ministry and work, health insurance, property insurance, pension program, very possibly, or not possibly, any new denomination that you went with you would have to be under their pension program. So there are a number of those kinds of benefits. Then there is also just the connectional benefits, so that we are a global church. We have connections all around the world. We participate in a variety of ministries like Encore, missionaries, and a variety of other things that we do together. So many of these connections, that's why we're called a connectional system, many of these connections would be lost for congregations that disaffiliate. We've had, actually, I'm sorry, it's been reported that in some conferences, when congregations have disaffiliated, they've then come back and said, but no, we still want to participate in the property insurance program, or we need health insurance for our clergy person. How are we to get that? Or what about a pension program? And so they've been coming back and asking these things. And, you know, I'm glad people are asking this question now. These would all be services that would be lost to the congregation through the United Methodist Church.
Someone put in here that if the admin boards votes to disaffiliate and then the church votes to disaffiliate, what challenges will be made at annual conference, since annual conference also gets a vote on that?
Well, first, just to clarify, the church council does not vote to disaffiliate. They vote to participate in the discernment process. So it's not a vote to disaffiliate, but a vote to participate in the discernment process. It is the church conference and a 2/3 vote by the church conference to disaffiliate. And then in terms of the annual conference, we've all been at annual conference, and it really is the will of the annual conference members, lay and clergy, in terms of their vote. So it is not an automatic vote. And, you know, it will be, you know, something that becomes before the annual conference session in order to disaffiliate. Matt, you were going to say something. I'm sorry there if I cut you off.
No, I that was my thinking as well. Is, you know, ultimately I think that conference leadership is going to try to stay hands off. They're not going to try to put their thumb on the scale. But at annual conference, I mean, it is a form of democracy, and it is possible that 100% of the church conference could vote in favor of disaffiliation. There could be a disaffiliation agreement, terms and conditions set by the conference trustees, and the annual conference could fail to ratify it.
Right. And just, you know, to explain our polity, you know, we have congregations that have authority over their ministry and what they do. And then annual conferences that, as the Book of Discipline described it, is the primary connectional body that connects the local church to the general church. And as that primary connectional body, it has certain authority and responsibilities to maintain the connection, to take actions on behalf of the greater connection. And particularly as that relates to the trust clause, that's why the annual conference is so critical. It doesn't go to the general conference, it goes to the annual conference, which is the primary connectional body between the local church and the general church.
What happens to a loan from the conference to a church that disaffiliates?
Under the disaffiliation agreement as it exists now, any loans from the conference or from a United Methodist related entity would need to be repaid prior to disaffiliation. Now, to be clear, if we're talking about a mortgage, that could be a refinance. It wouldn't have to be you know, completely repaid, but it would have to find a non-United Methodist related lender.
How will we build trust with churches that seek disaffiliation and then cannot follow through?
Well, just because a church seeks to participate in the process, it does not mean that the church's mind is made up, that in that discernment process, it may decide to stay, or it may not get the 2/3 votes necessary for disaffiliation. The cabinet has been in conversation already about our needing to be pastoral with all of our congregations, those that may disaffiliate, but also those that may have differences within the congregation about disaffiliation or about ministry within the United Methodist Church. So we pledge to work with all the congregations in what is going to be most helpful to the congregation and at what pace that is going to be most helpful to the congregation. You know, I'm just going to say that a congregation that has a 50-50 vote is going to feel bruised after a process like this. And we will work very closely with the congregation at the pace and the timing that's going to be most helpful. And so there may need to be just a period of settling before conversation, or a congregation may say, we need to have the conversation immediately to help us figure out how to move forward together. And so we'll be open to that. We'll be sensitive to those types of things and seek the wisdom of the pastor and the leadership of the congregation about how best to work with the congregation during that time.
Thank you. It is 7:30 and we have covenanted to being on for an hour. I will say that we have recorded this session. We've recorded all of the Q&As and the answers. And so we will be formulating an FAQ to put out onto the website along with the recording. And we thank you so much for joining us this evening and for listening to our resident experts, Bishop Scholl and Matt Morley, and bid you a good evening.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody. And we will make sure, and you should feel free to send in. You can send them to Joe, or you can send them directly to me. Any additional questions? I know how it always is. After a meeting, I always think of 2 or 3 more questions I wanted to ask or that came to my mind. Please, our desire is to help resource you. So these will be put into an FAQ so that you'll have those responses. I'm going to ask our team also just to stay on for a moment after everybody else drops off. But thank you, everybody. We're grateful for your leadership. We're grateful for your ministry and your congregation. We look forward to our continued work together. May God bless you all. Thank you.